7:07 Nashville's Morning News on Super Talk 99.7 WTN. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Dan, along with Johnny B, Ken Weaver, Hans von Spakovsky from the Heritage Foundation joining us as well, a legal analyst for Nashville's Morning News and Heritage. Hans, thank you for joining us. Of course, it is a topic that you and I have discussed many times before. Finally came to fruition. Former President Donald Trump booted off of the ballot for 2024. I think it's probably only temporary. But Hans, go ahead and tell me, were you surprised by what they did? And then we'll get into the specific law.
Well, I was shocked by really the judicial arrogance of the Colorado Supreme Court. And the thing for people to keep in mind is, look, this was a decision 4-3. So basically, you have 4 state judges taking away the ability of the American people to make their own decision on who should be president and throwing him off the ballot. Now, look, I read the decision as soon as it came out, and I can tell you this was a nakedly partisan decision that ignores the law. And the way you know that is that, look, they actually thumbed their nose at the U.S. Supreme Court and defied precedent. And let me give you a quick example of that. The disqualification provision in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, as you and I have discussed, it only applies to you if you were previously an officer of the United States. Despite what people may think, Donald Trump was never an officer of the United States. Why? Because there are multiple U.S. Supreme Court decisions saying that term, an officer of the United States, means that you're someone who was appointed to a position in the executive branch, not elected. So Joe Biden, for example, he's not an officer of the U.S. because he was elected. Merrick Garland, who, as you know, is the Attorney General, he is an officer of the U.S. Why? Well, because he was appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So this is U.S. Supreme Court precedent. Well, what's the Colorado Supreme Court say? We're just going to ignore that. Donald Trump was an officer of the U.S., and so this provision applies to him.
Their reasoning, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, that states anyone who took an oath to support the Constitution but then engaged in insurrection or rebellion against that government cannot hold office. Now, of course, Hans, it was meant to apply to Confederates who fought for the South.
Right.
It is being, according to many, misapplied in this case. I mean, people can't even write in Donald Trump's name, even if they wanted to.
No, that's right. And look, there's another example of their complete and total arrogance, because these 4 judges say, Donald Trump, yeah, he was guilty of insurrection. Well, what are they doing? They're substituting their judgment for that of Congress. Look, Congress already dealt with this issue. Remember, the second impeachment resolution that was approved by the House on January 11th, 2021, it charged him with incitement of insurrection. And what happened when the trial was held in the Senate? He was acquitted. So these judges, once again, these 4 local state judges are basically overriding the judgment of the U.S. Senate, which represents all the states in the union. Again, that's just an example of their unbelievable arrogance.
You know, it's interesting, too, because, one of the things that they did was they took I'm going to air quote this, the evidence from the January 6th commission, and they used, right, from what I understand, that body of evidence to boot him off the ballot. Now, of course, not in the body of evidence is...
I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
Now, they leave out, of course, the fact that the president did say on that day, peacefully and patriotically protest. And so that was something that clearly was manipulated during the commission and now in the presentation, because I covered this a while back, where they also took out the part where he said peacefully and patriotically. But, that commission, Hans, as you well know, I mean, that thing was as politically motivated as this thing coming out of Colorado.
No, that's right. And in fact, one of the dissenting judges who really went after the majority points out the fact that, look, the charge of insurrection, that is a serious criminal charge. And he says, look, there was a complete lack of basic due process, not only in the lower court decision in Colorado, but certainly with the January 6th committee. It wasn't run like a trial. Donald Trump didn't have the ability to call his own witnesses to cross-examine the other witnesses. It was just a show hearing to get Donald Trump, and the kind of due process that's necessary to prove a charge of insurrection, that did not occur. So again, it's the court should not have relied on that. By the way, another thing is, look, there's a lot of constitutional law experts, I'm one of them, who mentioned the fact that we don't think Section 3 even exists legally anymore. Why? Because Congress passed 2 amnesty acts in the late 1800s that potentially got rid of Section 3 entirely. Do you know that in a 100-page opinion, there's not one word by the majority about those 2 amnesty acts and the effects they might have? Not one word. So they just ignore that.
Well, you talk about the arrogance of these folks. This was from the majority opinion. We conclude that the foregoing evidence, the great bulk of which was undisputed at trial, established that President Trump engaged in insurrection. Well, that goes back to what we were just saying, Hans. They say it was undisputed. Well, that's because there was nobody on Donald Trump's side during this commission. I mean, this is something that, at least to me, when you look at what they're clearly trying to do, which is kick Donald Trump off the ballot, it's going to go to the Supreme Court. And I would assume, Hans, that the Supreme Court will reverse that. So I guess my question, Hans, is you think the Supreme Court is just going to go ahead and, I don't know what the proper terminology is, but will they take the case, and what happens then?
They can and they should. Remember, this was the decision of the highest state court in Colorado. So the only place it can be appealed to is the U.S. Supreme Court. And since they are, frankly, misinterpreting and misapplying a provision in the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. Supreme Court has full authority to take this case. They should take it. They should toss this case out as soon as possible. They need to hear this on an emergency, expedited basis because, look, the primaries in states around the country are all coming up quickly. The ballots are already being printed. And, look, this isn't the only case. There's a case proceeding in Michigan. There's a case in Oregon. I mean, there are cases like this been filed. The Supreme Court needs to take this and, frankly, throw out and dismiss the Colorado Supreme Court's decision and short-circuit the cases that have been ongoing in all these other states.
So, Hans, I was reading about just that part of this discussion, which is they're allowed to do that, right? You've got I think it's more than a dozen states, and you correctly identified Michigan as one of them, where, I mean, they've got all of these different cases and they kind of watch each other to see who's got the best case. But the Supreme Court can just say, well, all of you are full of you-know-what, and this is not going to, stand.
Yeah, all the Supreme Court has to do is issue a ruling saying Section 3 does not apply to Donald Trump because he was never an officer of the United States, and that ends every one of these cases in every state. And I just don't see how they can turn down and refuse to take an appeal of this case.
I don't think they will. I think that the folks that I read and the folks that I listen to, and even some of the people on the left I've been reading, and they will begrudgingly say that even the fact that the Colorado Supreme Court says they won't even allow people to write in Donald Trump's name is just, I mean, you said it before, you're stunned at the arrogance of this case. We've only got a minute and a half left, Hans, so give me your thoughts on whether or not you believe that this will actually motivate people on the right to support Donald Trump even more, like we saw with the indictments.
Oh, I think it will. I mean, this just adds to the story that he is being persecuted by the left because they're so afraid he'll get elected president. And look, here's the thing for your listeners to realize. Look, even if you don't like Donald Trump, even if you can't stand Donald Trump, you ought to be upset by this decision because it's really anti-democratic. You've got 4 judges taking away your ability as a voter to make the ultimate decision on who should be president. And I don't care who you support in the presidential race next year, you ought to be against that kind of thing happening. Because if it's going to happen in this case and it's successful, what do you think is going to happen in future elections and future races? And by the way, just quickly remind folks, remember, when Barack Obama was elected president, there were similar lawsuits just like this filed in courts across the country claiming that he was not qualified to be president because he was not a natural-born citizen. Those cases all were thrown out as they should have been, and that's what needs to happen to these cases too.
All right, Hans von Spakovsky, thank you very much for joining us here on Nashville's Morning News.